The town of Watseka, Illinois, lay quiet beneath a blanket of thick morning fog. Rows of old Victorian homes stood in stillness, their windows reflecting the muted light of dawn. It was the kind of town where the past never truly left, where stories whispered across generations like echoes through time. Dr. E.W. Stevens arrived at the Vennum household just as the church bells struck 7. The air smelled of damp earth and burning wood from nearby chimneys. Inside the modest home, the atmosphere was far less serene. 15-year-old Lurancy Vennum sat stiffly in her chair, her hands trembling in her lap. Her eyes, once warm and bright, had turned hollow, distant. She barely acknowledged her parents, who hovered nearby, their faces lined with exhaustion. Her mother, Mary, clutched a rosary, lips moving in silent prayer. "Lurancy," Dr. Stevens said softly, kneeling beside her. "Can you tell me what's wrong?" The girl lifted her head, and a shiver ran through the room. "My name is not Lurancy," she whispered. Her voice had changed, older, steadier. "I am Mary Roff." A gasp escaped from Mary Vennum's lips. Dr. Stevens stiffened. The name Mary Roff was not unfamiliar to the town. She had died 12 years ago. The Vennum family had always been a quiet, respectable household. Watseka Vennum, Lurancy's father, was a hard-working man, well known in Watseka for his honesty and devotion to his family. Mary Vennum, his wife, was a deeply religious woman who clung to her faith in times of hardship. Their daughter, Lurancy, had been an ordinary girl, kind, soft-spoken, and curious about the world. But in the summer of 1877, everything changed. It began with strange episodes. Lurancy would stare into space for long periods, speaking in hushed tones to someone unseen. Then came the seizures. They struck suddenly, leaving her writhing on the floor, her body convulsing in ways that terrified her family. "The angels are calling me," she whispered one night, clutching her mother's hand. At first, the Vennums believed it was a medical affliction. They consulted doctors, but none could explain her symptoms. The attacks grew worse. Lurancy spoke in languages she had never learned. She described places she had never visited. Her voice at times changed entirely, as if someone else was speaking through her. Rumors spread quickly through Watseka. Some whispered that Lurancy was mad. Others believed she was possessed. Desperate for help, Watseka and Mary Vennum turned to Dr. E.W. Stevens, a respected physician with an interest in spiritual phenomena. Stevens listened carefully as they recounted their daughter's strange behavior. He had heard of cases like this before, of spirits lingering beyond death, finding ways to speak through the living. But what happened next defied even his expectations. The first time he met Lurancy, she sat motionless, her pale hands folded in her lap. When she lifted her gaze, her expression was calm, serene. "I'm Mary Roff," she said again, with certainty. Stevens felt a chill creep up his spine. Mary Roff had lived in Watseka 12 years ago. Like Lurancy, she had suffered from mysterious episodes, seizures, and visions. She had died in 1865 at the age of 18. Dr. Stevens decided to test the claim. He arranged for Lurancy to meet the Roff family, Mary Roff's parents, who had never met the Vennums before. The moment Lurancy saw them, she ran into their arms. "Mother, father," she cried. For the first time in months, her face was filled with joy. The Vennums stood frozen in shock as Lurancy embraced a woman she had never seen before, tears streaming down her face. "I've missed you," she whispered. The Roffs wept. Because somehow, impossibly, the girl standing before them spoke, moved, and remembered, just like their dead daughter. The town of Watseka was divided. News of Lurancy Vennum's transformation spread like wildfire. Some believed it was a miracle, proof of life after death. Others whispered darker theories, possession, deceit, or madness. But the Roff family had no doubts. From the moment Lurancy stepped into their home, she moved through it with familiarity, recalling details no one outside the family could have known. "This was my room," she said, touching the wooden bedpost with affection. "I used to sit by that window and watch the church bells ring every morning." She called the Roff parents by name, spoke lovingly of her long-departed brother, and even recognized old neighbors. But the most chilling moment came when she unearthed a small, forgotten keepsake. A hairpin Mary Roff had once hidden in a crack of the bedroom floorboards. The Roffs wept. Meanwhile, the Vennums watched in stunned silence. Their daughter, their sweet, innocent Lurancy, was gone. The girl who had once played in their fields and helped her mother with chores now lived as someone else. She barely acknowledged them, her memories of her own life seemingly erased. Despite their sorrow, they agreed to let Lurancy stay with the Roffs for a time. Perhaps they hoped this bizarre episode would pass on its own. Days turned into weeks. Lurancy, now calling herself Mary, settled into the Roff household as if she had never left. She laughed, she played music, she even comforted her grieving parents as if she had been resurrected just for them. But beneath the joy, an unease lingered. At night, the Roff house was not quiet. Footsteps echoed through empty halls. Candle flames flickered without wind. Mrs. Roff often woke to find Lurancy sitting upright in bed, staring into the darkness. "The others," Lurancy whispered one night, "they don't want me to stay." Mrs. Roff shuddered. "Who, dear?" Lurancy's lips trembled. "The ones who never crossed over." Dr. Stevens kept detailed records of Lurancy's transformation, visiting her often to study her condition. He found her knowledge of Mary Roff's life unshakable, her mannerisms identical. But something disturbed him, something he dared not share with the others just yet. Lurancy was changing again. Her expressions were shifting. Some nights, she seemed like Mary Roff, cheerful and loving. Other nights she was distant, confused. Then, as the weeks passed, a new presence emerged. A voice, deeper and colder. "She's coming back," Lurancy muttered one evening, eyes glazed over. Dr. Stevens frowned. "Who is?" A slow, eerie smile crept onto her face. "Lurancy." The change was slow at first, subtle flickers in Lurancy's behavior. One day, she would be Mary Roff, laughing and reminiscing about childhood memories that belonged to another life. But at night, the house felt different, heavier. Then, one evening, everything shifted. Lurancy sat in the Roff parlor, gazing into the fire, when her hands suddenly tensed. Her breath hitched, her body stiffened, and the room grew unnervingly silent. Mrs. Roff leaned forward. "Mary?" she asked gently. Lurancy's lips trembled, then parted. But the voice that came out was not Mary's. It was deeper, hollow, like a whisper carried on a cold wind. "She doesn't belong here." A chill rippled through the room. Dr. Stevens, who had been observing quietly, rose to his feet. "Who are you?" he demanded. Lurancy turned to him slowly. Her pupils, once warm and bright, were now ink-black voids. "She's trying to come back," the voice rasped. "But she's not alone." The fire dimmed in the hearth. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, though the night outside was still. Lurancy's body convulsed violently, her arms flailing, her head jerking backward as if unseen hands pulled her from within. She opened the door, the voice whispered through clenched teeth. And now we all want to turn. A force slammed through the room. Picture frames fell from the walls, a chair toppled over, and Mrs. Roff clutched her rosary in terror. Dr. Stevens rushed forward, pressing his hands on Lurancy's shoulders. "Lurancy, Mary, whoever you are, fight it." For a long moment, she remained rigid. Then, her eyes fluttered, her body slackened, and a single tear rolled down her cheek. "I want to go home," she whispered weakly. It was Lurancy's voice. The Roffs stared in disbelief. The presence of Mary, so strong and undeniable just days before, was fading. The girl sitting before them now was not the lost daughter they had welcomed. It was Lurancy Vennum, confused and terrified. She clutched her chest, looking around the room. Where am I?" The possession was breaking. But as Lurancy trembled in Mrs. Roff's arms, Dr. Stevens knew the truth. Whatever had taken hold of her, whatever voices had spoken through her, were still waiting. And they were not leaving alone. After months of living as Mary Roff, walking, speaking, and remembering a life that was not her own, she had returned to the Vennum household, shaken but whole. The spirit of Mary, once so strong within her, had faded like mist at dawn. The Roffs mourned in silence. For a brief time, they had their daughter back, laughing, breathing, calling them by name. Now she was gone again. But unlike her first death, this time they could not grieve openly. To the world, Mary Roff had been dead for 12 years. And yet, a part of her had lived once more. Dr. Stevens visited often, watching Lurancy closely. At first she was fragile, barely speaking, barely eating. Then, slowly, her strength returned. She began to smile again. Her eyes regained their light. But there were moments, fleeting, quiet moments, when her gaze would drift into the distance, as if listening to something no one else could hear. One evening, as she sat with her mother, she whispered, "She's at peace now." Mary Roff was gone. But the others, the voices in the dark, the restless ones that had tried to take her, remained a mystery. Lurancy never spoke of them again. In the years that followed, she lived a quiet, happy life. She married, had children, and grew old. But in Watseka, whispers of her story never faded. Some called her a liar. Others believed she had been truly possessed. And some, those who had seen it firsthand, still wondered. Had Lurancy Vennum truly lived two lives? Or had something else been watching through her eyes, waiting for its turn to live? Even after death, some spirits refused to rest, waiting, watching, searching for a way back.